The English royal court established strict laws to isolate the Queen Dowager from the nobility. Guards were stationed everywhere to protect the bed of King Henry V's widow. Any lord who approached her without a royal decree was considered a direct threat to the throne. The one who bypassed that barrier was Owen Tudor, a disenfranchised servant who managed the royal wardrobe. He stepped into the most strictly restricted bedroom in England, secretly married her, and became the Queen Dowager's phantom husband. His public beheading was the ultimate price he paid. But history still recognizes him as the man who planted the seed for the Tudor dynasty. How did a penalized Welsh commoner cross the most heavily guarded threshold in Europe to permanently hijack the English bloodline? The story of Owen Tudor begins in a hostile, severely regulated environment following a crushed Welsh rebellion. His unlikely rise did not start in the wealthy halls of Westminster. Instead, it began in a strict landscape defined by total legal and economic control. This harsh reality shaped the path he took to enter the royal inner circle. Owen was born around 1400 in Pemenyd on the rugged Welsh island of Anglesey. During this period, fixed family surnames did not exist in traditional Welsh culture. His name followed a local system that served as a spoken map of his ancestry. He was known as Owain ap Maredudd ap Tudor, meaning Owen, son of Meredith, son of Tudor. Years later, his royal descendants hired historians to rewrite his family history for political legitimacy. Writers created fake genealogies tracing Owen back to a legendary British king named Cadwallader. At the same time, hostile English rumors tried to insult his roots by calling his father a lowly tavern keeper. Both of these extreme stories were completely false. Administrative records prove that the Tudors of Pemenyd were actually respected members of the local Welsh nobility. For generations, his ancestors worked as vital local administrators for the English government. After King Edward I conquered Wales, the English crown realized they could not rule the region alone. They relied heavily on established local families like Owens to manage the regional infrastructure. The Tudor family filled this exact operational void. Owen's father, Meredudd ap Tudor, was not a common laborer. He was an integrated state official. Between 1388 and 1391, Meredudd served as the esciator for Anglesey, a profoundly technical royal appointment responsible for managing and repossessing estates that reverted to the crown. Furthermore, he held the documented status of a burgess in Newborough. Meredudd and his brothers represented the bureaucratic elite of Wales, entrusted by the English sovereign to execute localized taxation, enforce property law, and maintain the fragile administrative peace of the conquered territory. This administrative security ended at the turn of the 15th century. A massive Welsh uprising shattered the alliance between the English crown and local officials. In 1400, an exceptionally capable Welsh nobleman named Owain Glyndwr initiated a full-scale military rebellion against the newly crowned King Henry IV of England. The Glyndwr uprising was not a localized border dispute. It was an intensely organized nationalistic war for unconditional sovereignty, faced with a critical geopolitical choice. Maredudd ap Tudor and Owen's uncles executed a devastating miscalculation. They abandoned their secure administrative portfolios, severed their allegiance to the English crown, and committed the entirety of the Tudor family's military and financial assets to the rebel cause. They transitioned from royal bureaucrats into active insurgents. The initial phases of the rebellion yielded significant tactical victories, but the overwhelming resources, manpower, and sheer scale of the English military apparatus eventually asserted dominance. King Henry IV and his military commanders eventually crushed the Welsh uprising. However, the state's retribution against the insurgent leadership went far beyond physical executions. The crown deployed a strategy of total economic and social annihilation. Prior to their treason, the Tudor family had operated as high-level administrators. Because of this deep systemic knowledge, the English state targeted them with specific severity. Their vast ancestral lands in Anglesey were formally seized by the Crown. Their accumulated wealth was confiscated. The socio-political standing they had meticulously built over generations was erased. Murad ap Tudor essentially vanishes from the historical record around 1404 or 1406, likely reaching the end of his natural lifespan when Owen was just a small child, leaving his heir to inherit nothing but the stigma of a defeated rebel. The violent suppression of the Glyndŵr Rebellion was immediately followed by a far more enduring legal and political crackdown. King Henry IV and the English Parliament recognized that military victories in Wales were temporary. To ensure permanent submission, they had to legally dismantle the capacity of the Welsh people to organize, govern, or arm themselves to prevent any future armed conflicts and uprisings. The state criminalized the possession of military assets. Welshmen were strictly forbidden by law from owning armor, carrying weapons, or maintaining defensible fortifications. However, the most damaging statutes targeted the socio-economic mobility of the population. The legislation explicitly barred any individual of Welsh descent from purchasing land within the borders of England or within the English-controlled borough towns inside Wales. Furthermore, they were permanently disqualified from holding any public office, sitting on juries, or serving in any administrative capacity that held jurisdiction over an English citizen. Within this dense framework of oppressive legislation, Parliament embedded one specific statute that would define the exact legal parameters of Owen Tudor's future treason. In medieval Europe, wealth, territory, and political legitimacy were primarily transferred through marital contracts. Recognizing this reality, the English government sought to block the Welsh from infiltrating the power structure through strategic dynastic marriages. The penal laws explicitly banned intermarriage between the two demographics. An Englishman who married a Welsh woman lost his civic privileges, and crucially, any Welshman who attempted to marry an English woman was committing a severe statutory offense. By enacting these laws, the English Parliament successfully established a legal quarantine around the Welsh population. The Tudor family, stripped of their estates and their administrative utility, was firmly demoted to the status of second-class citizens in their own homeland. They were locked out of the military, barred from the economy, and isolated from the aristocratic marriage market. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion and the imposition of the penal laws plunged Owen Tudor's youth into obscurity. Without a father, stripped of his territorial inheritance, and legally categorized as a subversive alien by the reigning government, Owen was forced into historical shadows. Unverified local traditions suggest he was fostered by Sir John Scudamore of Troy, a family possessing long-standing connections to the Tudors. Other folkloric accounts attempt to inject him into the center of English military glory, placing him on the muddy, blood-soaked battlefield of Agincourt in 1415 as a teenage squire to King Henry V. While the exact pathway of his early survival remains undocumented, the undeniable historical outcome proves that Owen executed a remarkable internal adaptation. He recognized that the violent armed rebellion utilized by his father's generation had resulted in total systemic failure. Armed resistance against the overwhelming might of the English state was a guaranteed path to dynastic ruin. If he intended to survive and reclaim any degree of socio-political agency, he could not operate as a Welsh insurgent. He had to learn to navigate the very legal and administrative system that had been explicitly designed to destroy him. Operating under the severe restrictions of the penal laws, Owen initiated a calculated process of cultural assimilation. He shed the complex Welsh patronymic system that immediately identified him as a target. By anglicizing his name to Owen Meredith, he actively erased the linguistic markers that betrayed his heritage, effectively shielding his background from the reigning authorities. He mastered the linguistic and behavioral protocols of the English gentry, utilizing his intellect and physical capability to blend into the background of the occupying power. This strategy of active integration, born out of utter desperation and the trauma of a ruined lineage, prepared him for the next phase of his journey. He was no longer a Welsh rebel awaiting execution. He was a highly adaptable, uncredentialed outsider navigating his way through the vulnerabilities of the English administrative machine, positioning himself to cross a heavily guarded threshold that would forever alter the dynastic lineage and royal bloodline of the English monarchy. The strategy of cultural adaptation executed by Owen Tudor yielded its first documented, verifiable result in the spring of 1421. Having successfully scrubbed the linguistic markers of his Welsh identity and adapted to the operational protocols of the occupying power, the individual now registered as Owen Meredith entered the primary military and administrative networks of the English state. He did not achieve this through aristocratic patronage, which was entirely unavailable to him, but through the demonstration of unfailing reliability and competence in a theater of war. The historical record locates him formally joining the military retinue of Sir Walter Hungerford. This specific placement was not a random assignment. It served as the critical catalyst for the entire trajectory of the Tudor dynasty. Hungerford was an exceptionally powerful magnate, a veteran military commander operating deeply within the inner circle of King Henry V, and most importantly, he held the immensely influential position of steward of the royal household. By securing a position under Hungerford, Owen attached himself directly to the inner machinery of the English government. During the grueling, highly volatile military campaigns across northern France, Owen operated not as a romanticized knight-errant, but as a deeply functional administrative and military asset. He managed supplies, facilitated communication, and proved his utility to the highest echelons of the English command structure. It was precisely through this grueling administrative pipeline that Owen Tudor bypassed the impenetrable social barriers of the 15th century, transferring from the battlefields of France directly into the heavily guarded, paranoid center of the royal court at Westminster. Operating under the sponsorship of the steward of the royal household, Owen Tudor secured an appointment that represented a massive structural anomaly within the rigid hierarchy of feudal Europe. He was installed as the keeper of the wardrobe for Catherine of Valois, the Dowager Queen of England. The position of keeper of the wardrobe granted unprecedented political and physical access to a man stripped of his ancestral rights, functioning entirely beyond the modern interpretation of a mere storage title. In the operational framework of a medieval royal household, the wardrobe was not a mere storage closet for garments. It functioned as a complex, highly secure financial and administrative department. The keeper of the wardrobe was responsible for managing the queen's personal treasury, securing her high-value jewels and imported textiles, and directing the daily expenditures of her immediate retinue. More critically, this position carried an unprecedented degree of physical proximity. The architecture of a medieval court was designed to enforce distance. The physical space between a monarch and a subject strictly defined their relative power. Dukes, earls, and high-ranking prelates routinely spent months attempting to navigate through layers of guards, courtiers, and outer chambers merely to secure a brief audience with royalty. As keeper of the wardrobe, Owen Tudor entirely bypassed these traditional barriers. His administrative duties required constant, unmediated access to the most private, intimate rooms of the Queen's daily existence. He crossed the threshold into her personal chambers, managed the physical items that touched her skin, and operated entirely within her inner sanctum. The English state was completely blinded by its own rigid class prejudice. The Regency Council failed to comprehend the magnitude of their oversight. By heavily scrutinizing the high nobility, they had unknowingly permitted a landless foreign servant to deeply entrench himself within the Queen Mother's most intimate inner circle. Catherine's household operated as an intensely volatile political environment, driven entirely by her specific, rapidly depreciating status within the English state. Catherine of Valois was not a functioning partner in the governance of the realm. She was a woman trapped inside a gilded royal confinement, surrounded by a royal council that viewed her strictly as a diminishing political pawn. Born a French princess in 1401 to the severely mentally unstable King Charles VI, Catherine's early developmental years were defined by the trauma of the Hundred Years' War and the bloody factional violence paralyzing Paris. In 1420, following the catastrophic defeat of the French forces, her fertility and dynastic potential were weaponized as an instrument of international surrender. Under the strict parameters of the Treaty of Troyes, she was married to the conquering King Henry V of England. This union possessed zero romantic motivation. Catherine was engineered to function as a diplomatic vessel. Her sole geopolitical purpose was to bridge the two warring kingdoms by producing a dual monarch, a male heir who would possess the bloodline legitimacy to rule both England and France simultaneously. When Catherine successfully delivered a male heir, the future King Henry VI, in December 1421, she fulfilled her ultimate primary dynastic function for the realm. Less than a year later, in August 1422, King Henry V succumbed to a severe bout of dysentery during a military campaign in France. Catherine became a widow at the age of 21. Her infant son, less than a month old, inherited the throne of England. At that exact moment, Catherine's status within the English power structure inverted completely. She transitioned drastically from the kingdom's most vital maternal figure into an extreme, uncontrollable political liability. The death of a strong, adult monarch and the accession of an infant triggers an immediate, highly dangerous power vacuum in any autocratic system. In London, executive control shifted instantaneously to a ruthless, deeply factionalized Regency Council, dominated primarily by the late king's brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and the immensely wealthy prelate, Cardinal Henry Beaufort. Possessing physical custody of the boy king was the ultimate prize. The council recognized that controlling the child granted them unquestioned authority over the state treasury and royal patronage. They operated in a state of perpetual paranoia, actively neutralizing any potential rival who might threaten their monopoly on power. When the council evaluated the Dowager Queen, they viewed her existence as a severe political vulnerability. Catherine was young, possessed vital childbearing potential, and held the immensely influential status of the king's mother. Around 1425, informants within the court reported that Catherine was demonstrating clear romantic interest in Edmund Beaufort, a powerful, heavily landed English nobleman and the nephew of the cardinal. The Regency Council received this intelligence with profound alarm and immediate panic. In the mechanics of medieval politics, marriage equated to shared authority. This new familial proximity would grant a stepfather unparalleled, unmediated access to the developing sovereign, allowing him to bypass the council, dictate royal policy, and potentially trigger a devastating civil war to seize control of the regency. The Regency Council did not rely on diplomacy. Instead, they weaponized the law. In 1428, they passed a strict statute to strip Catherine of her marital autonomy. This act explicitly forbade any individual, regardless of their aristocratic rank or military capability, from entering into a marital contract with the Dowager Queen without the explicit written consent of the adult king. Because King Henry VI was a mere 6 years old at the time the statute was formally enacted, this strict legislation effectively mandated an inescapable delay of over a full decade before Catherine could even legally petition to remarry. The enforcement mechanism embedded within this legislation was absolute. The penalty for violating the act was total ruin. The state would execute the immediate permanent forfeiture of all lands, ancestral properties, financial assets, and personal freedom of the offending suitor. The council utilized the threat of complete economic annihilation to construct a legislative quarantine around the Queen Mother, essentially locking her inside a permanent state of widowhood. The parliamentary statute functioned with flawless precision against its intended targets. Edmund Beaufort, possessing vast agricultural estates, lucrative wardships, and extensive political influence, immediately recognized the lethal consequences of defying the council. Unwilling to sacrifice his massive accumulation of capital, he abruptly terminated his relationship with the Queen and retreated entirely from her orbit. The Regency Council assumed their legislative strike had permanently stabilized the royal household. They believed they had successfully terrorized the English nobility into submission. However, in drafting a law specifically designed to deter wealthy, heavily landed magnates, the architects of the statute created a massive, unforeseen structural vulnerability. Stripped of her autonomy, isolated from her son, and treated functionally as a high-value prisoner of the state, Catherine's psychological response was not quiet submission, but explosive outrage. Contemporary chronicles report that the Dowager Queen, recognizing she was surrounded by men who valued their estates more than her person, declared a radical shift in her marital strategy. She actively sought a partner whom the wealthy regents could not intimidate, threaten, or financially ruin. The council's law relied entirely on the assumption that any man approaching the Queen would have lands for the state to confiscate. Catherine identified the fatal flaw in their logic. To bypass the statute, she simply needed to select a man who had entirely nothing left to lose. Within her own private chambers, operating right past the blind spot of the English elite, the disenfranchised Welsh wardrobe keeper and the imprisoned French princess found themselves perfectly dangerously aligned. The rigid legal blockade engineered by the English Regency Council successfully terrorized the established nobility, but it operated on a fundamentally flawed premise. The council operated on the assumption that power, ambition, and strategic dynastic alliances could only exist between individuals possessing massive agricultural estates and recognized aristocratic titles. They failed to calculate the actions of a dowager queen who had been systematically stripped of her political agency and isolated from her child. By removing all authorized avenues of marital and diplomatic mobility, the state inadvertently incentivized Catherine of Valois to subvert the system entirely. She required an operative who operated below the radar of the state's financial extortion. She found him within the intimate, closely guarded perimeter of her own personal wardrobe. The exact chronological moment the Dowager Queen and the Welsh servant breached the unyielding, rigid boundaries of their respective social stations is not recorded in official state documents. Administrative ledgers do not catalog treasonous intimacies. However, the event was captured in contemporary court gossip and the chronicles of subsequent generations. Analyzing these accounts through a forensic lens reveals less about romance and more about the staggering sociological shock of their physical union. One prominent historical account details a royal banquet where Owen Tudor, executing his duties while slightly intoxicated, lost his spatial coordination and fell directly into the lap of the Dowager Queen. Another detailed account, recorded by the Welsh chronicler Ellis Griffith, describes a summer afternoon where Catherine observed Owen swimming. Intrigued by his raw athleticism and vitality, she disguised herself in the unadorned clothing of a maid to approach him. Unaware of her true identity, Owen forcefully kissed her, inadvertently scratching her face when she resisted. The following evening, while serving her in his official capacity, Owen identified the physical mark on her face and realized his fatal error. To modern sensibilities, these narratives resemble courtly folklore. However, within the rigidly structured, violently enforced hierarchy of the 15th century, these actions constituted severe statutory crimes. Touching the physical body of a sovereign without explicit permission was an act of lèse majesté, punishable by immediate imprisonment or execution. The critical data point in these chronicles is not the physical contact itself, but the Queen's reaction. Catherine did not summon the royal guards. She did not authorize his execution. She actively chose quiet forgiveness and complicity. By refusing to enforce the strict physical boundaries of her rank, Catherine made a shrewdly calculated political decision. She accepted the breach, effectively authorizing this marginalized outsider to cross the ultimate threshold. Sometime between 1428 and 1432, the consensus of administrative evidence points to 1429. Shortly after Catherine physically relocated her primary residence away from her son's highly monitored household to her private estates in Hertfordshire, Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois committed an unprecedented act of treason against the parliamentary statute. They executed a marital contract in profound secrecy. To maintain this union, they were forced to engineer a high-stakes, deeply hidden double life. The logistics of hiding a royal marriage required flawless daily execution. In the public corridors of the royal manors, Owen maintained the perfect, unyielding facade of a subservient wardrobe keeper. He executed the required physical deference, bowed deeply in the presence of witnesses, and addressed his wife strictly by her formal titles. The physical reality of their marriage was strictly quarantined behind the heavy oak doors of Catherine's private chambers. Their secret was protected by the council's own bias. The Regency Council maintained a vast network of paid informants and spies. However, this surveillance was entirely focused on monitoring the movements of powerful aristocrats. The Dukes of York, the Beauforts, and the powerful northern earls. The state's security apparatus focused solely on recognized aristocratic titles and coats of arms, leaving them fundamentally blind to threats emerging from the servant class. The Dukes of Gloucester and the Cardinal Beaufort literally could not conceive of the scenario. Within their rigid operational logic, it was a fundamental impossibility that a proud French princess, the daughter of a king and the widow of the legendary Henry V, would willingly degrade her royal bloodline by physically binding herself to a disenfranchised Welsh servant. Prejudice functioned as Owen Tudor's ultimate camouflage, allowing him to operate a shadow marriage directly beneath the gaze of the most paranoid government in Europe. Owen Tudor was not a passive participant merely hiding in the Queen's shadow. He recognized that maintaining the marriage required slowly dismantling the legal vulnerabilities that defined his status as a Welsh commoner. Operating under the cover of the council's blind spot, he utilized Catherine's remaining influence to execute a systematic, quiet upgrade of his legal status. The penal laws of Henry IV strictly prohibited a Welshman from owning property in England or holding civic rights. In 1432, a quiet administrative petition was processed through the royal bureaucracy. Owen Tudor was officially granted the statutory rights of an Englishman. This single piece of legislation functioned as a critical legal firewall, shielding him from the immediate application of the anti-Welsh penal codes and providing him with a baseline of constitutional protection. Having secured his civic status, the couple moved to fortify their localized economy. By March 1434, Catherine confidently exercised her authority over her personal dower lands, explicitly granting Owen lucrative administrative privileges on her estates in Flintshire. They were utilizing standard bureaucratic procedures to build a small, defensible economic perimeter, preparing for the inevitable moment when their secret would be exposed. The administrative facade they had meticulously constructed was ultimately compromised by an undeniable physical and maternal reality. A secret marriage can be sustained through behavioral discipline, but continuous pregnancies cannot be indefinitely concealed from a royal household populated by dozens of servants and visiting dignitaries. Catherine began to experience back-to-back pregnancies. To keep the Regency Council from discovering her subsequent pregnancies, Catherine engineered a careful and highly disciplined campaign of deception. Whenever her physical condition became impossible to mask with heavy court garments, she initiated a tactical retreat. She would frequently feign severe illness, cite the medical necessity of clean air, and physically remove herself from the heavily scrutinized environment of the London court. She relocated to remote, strictly controlled rural estates deep in the countryside, such as Much Haddam and Hatfield. Within these secure, isolated environments, surrounded only by a microscopic circle of utterly loyal, heavily vetted retainers, Catherine delivered her children in total secrecy. This clandestine operation produced at least 2 confirmed sons who survived infancy. Edmund Tudor was born around 1430 at Much Haddam, followed shortly by Jasper Tudor around 1431 at Hatfield. A third son, Owen, was also born in secret. He would eventually be placed into the total anonymity of the church, taking holy orders and serving as a monk at Westminster Abbey until 1501. The birth of Edmund and Jasper Tudor represented a profound, almost incomprehensible dynastic anomaly within the rigid structure of 15th century Europe. If one analyzed their royal lineage, these children carried the absolute pinnacle of the French Valois dynastic heritage. They were the direct maternal grandsons of King Charles VI of France. Furthermore, they were the biological half-brothers to the currently reigning sovereign of England, King Henry VI, yet, in the eyes of the English law, their legal categorization was fundamentally hostile to their true royal heritage. They were the product of a treasonous violation of a parliamentary statute. They bore the surname and the inherited social taint of an outcast who had been legally erased by the state. Centuries later, certain historical debates have attempted to apply retroactive skepticism to this lineage, theorizing that Edmund and Jasper were secretly the illegitimate offspring of Edmund Beaufort, Catherine's former suitor. However, subjecting this theory to the strict parameters of medieval ecclesiastical law reveals a total lack of structural logic. When Edmund Tudor later executed a marital contract with the wealthy heiress Margaret Beaufort in 1455, no legal or religious authority raised an objection based on consanguinity. If Edmund Tudor were actually Beaufort's biological son, he and Margaret would have been first cousins. In the 15th century, a union between first cousins strictly required a meticulously documented, immensely expensive papal dispensation from Rome to avoid the crime of incest. No such dispensation was ever sought, processed, or granted. Furthermore, decades later, when King Richard III launched a massive, state-sponsored propaganda campaign designed explicitly to destroy the Tudor claim to the throne, he meticulously attacked their Welsh lineage, but he never once deployed the accusation that Edmund was a Beaufort bastard. The undeniable truth of the Tudor family unit was firmly established. Owen Tudor's physical union with the Dowager Queen had successfully generated a new, highly volatile branch of the royal tree, incubated entirely in the shadows. But the consequences of time and human frailty acted as a ticking clock. The elaborate system of evasion, the fake illnesses, and the rural retreats could only delay the inevitable intelligence breach. The English state was about to uncover the massive security failure operating within the royal family, and the retribution would be absolute. In 1436, the elaborate illusion engineered by Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor suffered a catastrophic systemic failure. The clandestine marriage finally unraveled due to the sudden and unavoidable deterioration of the Queen's own physical health. Catherine contracted a severe, terminal illness. Her rapid decline necessitated a permanent withdrawal from her private, rigorously controlled rural estates. She was transported to the secluded religious sanctuary of Bermondsey Abbey to receive continuous tending for her fatal illness. This forced medical relocation abruptly stripped away the physical isolation that had successfully protected their secret from the royal court. By entering the abbey, Catherine lost the capacity to dictate access to her physical person. The strict operational isolation that had shielded her pregnancies and her Welsh husband was broken. The Dowager Queen was suddenly surrounded by state-appointed physicians, high-ranking clergy, and the pervasive surveillance network of the royal court. Deprived of Catherine's direct physical presence to control the environment, the existence of the secret marriage and the illegitimate royal children was rapidly exposed to the English elite. The reaction of the Regency Council and the established nobility was one of explosive, unmitigated outrage. They did not view the union simply as a violation of the 1428 parliamentary statute. They processed it as a grotesque contamination of the royal honor and a direct, humiliating insult to the sacred memory of the conquering King Henry V. The mother of the reigning sovereign had secretly bound herself to a member of a penalized, subordinate demographic. However, before the state could initiate formal legal proceedings against the Queen, her physical strength failed completely. On January 3, 1437, Catherine of Valois died at Bermondsey Abbey at the age of 35. The English government immediately attempted to erase this history. When Catherine was buried within the prominently visible, sacred precincts of Westminster Abbey, the state controlled the narrative of her monument. Her tomb bore entirely no inscription or heraldic acknowledgement of her second husband or her subsequent children. The government attempted to physically delete the existence of the Tudor marriage from the official architectural record of the realm. For Owen Tudor, the death of Catherine was an absolute tactical disaster. While she lived, her status as the Dowager Queen provided an impenetrable political and physical shield. Her demise instantly stripped him of his proximity to power. He was no longer the secret husband of the sovereign's mother. He was a highly vulnerable Welsh operative completely exposed to the lethal retribution of the Duke of Gloucester. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, acting as the primary enforcer of the Regency Council, struck immediately following the royal funeral. He issued a direct summons ordering Owen, who was stationed on estates in Northamptonshire, to present himself before the Royal Council in London to answer for his statutory crimes. Owen possessed a profoundly acute understanding of the English legal apparatus. He recognized that surrendering to an unconditioned summons would lead him straight to the executioner's block. He refused to travel to the capital without receiving a formalized, written guarantee of safe conduct. When he finally initiated his movement toward London, he anticipated the council's treachery. Upon entering the city, he completely bypassed the government's administrative centers. He navigated directly to Westminster Abbey and threw himself into the legal jurisdiction of religious sanctuary. Within the heavy stone walls of the abbey, Owen was legally untouchable. State authorities could not physically extract a fugitive from a recognized sanctuary without facing immediate excommunication and triggering a massive conflict with the church. Operating from this fortified legal position, Owen refused to exit the premises until the state provided ironclad guarantees for his physical survival. Following weeks of tense, mediated negotiations, a compromise was reached. In July 1437, Owen exited the abbey and proceeded to Kennington Palace to present himself before the assembled council. He formally swore his allegiance to the young King Henry VI and defended his actions. The council, restricted by the presence of the king and the terms of the negotiation, allowed him to depart. However, the state had no intention of allowing a man who had compromised the royal bloodline to walk away. The council engineered a dangerous legal trap. As Owen traveled westward, attempting to return to the safety of his Welsh networks, heavily armed government agents ambushed his retinue. They arrested him on the spot. When Owen protested, citing the safe conduct he had negotiated at Westminster, the state deployed a calculated technicality. The Privy Council argued that his safe conduct had only been a verbal agreement applicable strictly to his time in London, not a formalized, written writ protecting his journey home. To justify the arrest to the broader nobility, the government deliberately weaponized his heritage. They officially cited fears that Owen possessed malicious intent and, as a Welshman, would utilize his royal connections to incite a massive regional rebellion. If allowed to return to Anglesey, Owen Tudor was transported back to the capital in heavy iron chains. He was not afforded the comfortable confinement usually reserved for political prisoners of high status. The state sought to violently remind him of his baseline legal categorization. He was thrown into Newgate Prison, one of the most brutal, severely overcrowded, and disease-ridden penal facilities in medieval London. While Owen was shackled to the damp stone, the Regency Council initiated a comprehensive audit of his financial assets. They operated under the assumption that a commoner who had infiltrated the Queen's wardrobe must have utilized his proximity to embezzle massive amounts of royal wealth. The state dispatched agents to confiscate and inventory his entire personal estate. The resulting ledger, preserved in the historical record, completely dismantled the government's narrative of corruption. Owen's total confiscated wealth was valued at exactly 137 Dins 10s 4D, an amount roughly equivalent to $135,000 in modern valuation. The inventory listed items of high quality, including silver gilt cups, silver salt cellars, and fine candlesticks, but it contained no vast hoard of extorted royal treasure. The audit proved definitively that Owen Tudor had never leveraged his secret marriage to amass corrupt wealth or build a rival political faction. He had simply utilized his position to maintain a comfortable, highly discreet domestic existence. The English government calculated that the horrific physical conditions of Newgate Prison would rapidly degrade Owen's health and bodily resistance, effectively executing him through disease and exposure without the necessity of a public trial. They critically underestimated his immense bodily resilience and his unyielding capacity for violent, armed retaliation. Owen Tudor was not built for passive captivity. In early 1438, utilizing sheer physical force, he executed a violent, coordinated prison break. He did not act alone. He mobilized his personal priest and a fiercely loyal servant who had been confined with him. They did not attempt a stealth evasion. They initiated a direct, ferocious, unyielding assault on the Newgate guards. Utilizing whatever improvised weaponry they could secure, they inflicted severe physical injuries upon their captors, shattered the immediate security perimeter, and broke out into the labyrinthine streets of London. This violent, forceful escape demonstrated the undeniable physical capability that had originally drawn the Dowager Queen's attention. However, navigating the hostile, heavily policed urban environment of the capital proved impossible for a recognized fugitive. The freedom was short-lived. A specialized tracking unit commanded by Lord Beaumont successfully hunted down the escapees. Following his recapture, the state recognized that standard prison facilities were insufficient to contain him. Owen was transferred under maximum security to the imposing, heavily fortified structure of Windsor Castle. In a demonstration of profound, almost theatrical political irony, the council placed him under the direct, unyielding supervision of Edmund Beaufort, the exact same wealthy magnate whose fear of the 1428 statute had originally driven Catherine of Valois into Owen's arms. Owen Tudor languished within the high-security containment of Windsor Castle for over a year. The Regency Council intended to leave him there permanently. However, the operational reality of the English government was undergoing a fundamental transition. King Henry VI was approaching his legal majority, and as the young sovereign began to assert direct executive control over the state apparatus, he processed the data regarding his mother's secret marriage entirely differently than his paranoid uncles. King Henry VI did not view Owen Tudor as a subversive Welsh insurgent or a stain upon the royal honor. He recognized a man who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty to his mother and who had endured severe state persecution without compromising the royal family. On November 12, 1439, the king executed a definitive sovereign intervention. Henry VI issued a formal royal pardon, permanently neutralizing the legal threats against his stepfather. The king did not merely release Owen from Windsor, he actively integrated him into the legitimate power structure of the realm. Henry VI granted Owen an immensely lucrative and deeply symbolic royal pension of £40 a year and formally absorbed him into the royal household, conferring upon him the prestigious title of a King's Knight. While Owen secured his personal freedom and a stable military career, eventually commanding the English garrison at Regneville Castle in France, the state still strictly restricted his access to his children. Edmund and Jasper Tudor were initially kept under the supervision of Catherine de la Pole, the Abbess of Barking, entirely separated from their Welsh father. However, King Henry VI was determined to legitimize his maternal bloodline. In November 1452, the sovereign executed a constitutional maneuver that permanently altered the trajectory of British history. By direct royal decree, Henry VI elevated his half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper, to the peerage. Edmund Tudor was created the Earl of Richmond. Jasper Tudor was created the Earl of Pembroke. This was not a minor administrative promotion. It was a massive, unprecedented dynastic elevation. In a single day, the sons of a penalized Welsh wardrobe keeper became the highest-ranking nobles in the entire kingdom, holding precedence over every other aristocrat below the rank of duke. The king's decree functioned as the ultimate legal firewall. It permanently washed away the inherited social taint of their Welsh origins. The Tudor bloodline had officially breached the apex of the English aristocracy. Owen Tudor had successfully navigated his family out of the suffocating restrictions of the penal laws and into the highest echelons of absolute power. But this newfound dynastic stability was entirely dependent on the continued reign of King Henry VI. As the king's mental health began to precipitously decline in the 1450s, the entire architecture of the English state prepared to collapse into a devastating civil war, and the Tudor family would be forced to pay in blood for their proximity to the crown. The unprecedented elevation of Edmund and Jasper Tudor to the English peerage permanently bound the physical survival and dynastic future of the Tudor family to the political stability of the Lancastrian regime. However, in the 1450s, the central command structure of the English government experienced a catastrophic failure. King Henry VI suffered a total psychological collapse, rendering him incapable of executive administration. This power vacuum fractured the state, plunging the kingdom into the devastatingly destructive, multi-generational factional conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. The political landscape polarized entirely between the reigning House of Lancaster and the hostile House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York. Operating within this volatile theater, Owen and Jasper Tudor did not attempt to maintain diplomatic neutrality. They recognized that their vast estates, their aristocratic titles, and their physical safety derived entirely from the king. They inextricably tied their fate to the Lancastrian cause, utilizing their regional authority to raise military commissions and aggressively suppress Yorkist operatives across Wales. The bloody reality of the armed civil conflict was notoriously unpredictable, characterized by rapid shifts in military supremacy. By late 1460, the operational theater had devolved into utter chaos. The Yorkist faction successfully captured King Henry VI, forcing Parliament to pass an act of disinheritance that bypassed the king's own son. Months later, the Lancastrians counterattacked, slaughtering Richard of York at the Battle of Wakefield. The death of the Yorkist patriarch did not end the conflict. It merely transferred command of the Yorkist war machine to his 18-year-old heir, Edward, Earl of March. The young commander operated with extreme, unyielding ruthlessness. Driven by the execution of his father, Edward discarded the traditional chivalric protocols that governed the treatment of captured nobility. He instituted a policy of total warfare, intending to physically eradicate the Lancastrian command structure. In February 1461, the defining military engagement of Owen Tudor's life materialized. Jasper and Owen deployed their Lancastrian forces to intercept Edward's advancing army at Mortimer's Cross, near the Welsh border. Owen Tudor was over 60 years old. Despite having survived the penal laws, the persecution of the Regency Council, and the dungeons of Newgate, he did not delegate his command. He strapped on his heavy armor and marched onto the front lines to defend his stepson's crown. Prior to the infantry engagement, a severe meteorological anomaly occurred above the battlefield, a parhelion, which projected the optical illusion of 3 suns blazing simultaneously in the sky. Edward of March rapidly weaponized this atmospheric event. He convinced his vanguard that it was a direct, divine endorsement of the House of York representing the Holy Trinity. The psychological impact of this propaganda fractured the Lancastrian discipline. When the armies clashed, the battle devolved into a localized massacre. Jasper Tudor, utilizing his youth and extensive knowledge of the regional terrain, successfully executed a tactical retreat. Owen Tudor, severely slowed by his advanced age and the weight of his plate armor, was completely overrun. The Yorkist infantry breached his frontline formation and captured him alive. Edward of March immediately executed his policy of no quarter. He ordered the summary execution of all captured Lancastrian commanders, completely bypassing the established mechanisms of ransom or parliamentary trial. Owen Tudor was designated as a high-value prisoner of war and transported to the nearby market town of Hereford. For decades, Owen had successfully relied on his direct proximity to the sovereign to shield him from state violence. He had been pardoned by the king and protected by his royal stepson. As he was marched through the hostile streets toward the execution block situated in the market square on February 7, 1461, he operated under a profound cognitive illusion. Contemporary accounts note that he expected a rider to arrive with a royal pardon, or for the local regional magnates to intervene at the last moment to halt the execution. That illusion was only permanently shattered when he was forced to the block. The executioner stepped forward, roughly seized the collar of Owen's expensive, crimson velvet doublet, and violently ripped it downward, exposing his neck to the freezing winter air. Stripped of all administrative protection and facing the stark reality of his ultimate military defeat on the battlefield, Owen Tudor did not panic. Standing before the assembled crowd and the wooden block, he delivered a single, profoundly analytical statement regarding the staggering trajectory of his life. That head shall lie on the stock that was wont to lie on Queen Catherine's lap. He coldly acknowledged the staggering, almost incomprehensible trajectory of his own existence, from the intimate, closely guarded perimeter of the Dowager Queen's chambers to the brutal reality of a public, wartime decapitation. He knelt on the blood-soaked wood, and the state severed his head. Following the execution, the Yorkist forces placed his head on the highest step of the market cross as a warning to remaining Lancastrian loyalists. The historical record notes a final, quiet anomaly amidst the military occupation. A local woman, classified by chroniclers as mad, approached the cross. She washed the blood from his face, combed his hair, and surrounded his head with over 100 lit candles before his undocumented burial in the Church of the Greyfriars. The execution of Owen Tudor was engineered by the House of York as an act of brutal aristocratic housekeeping, designed to permanently sever a troublesome, illegitimate branch of the royal tree. Politically, however, the execution was a catastrophic failure. Exactly 24 years after the executioner's axe fell in the Hereford Market Square, the living dynastic threat Owen Tudor had successfully incubated in the shadows was finally unleashed. In August 1485, his grandson, Henry Tudor, launched an invasion force at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He completely annihilated the Yorkist military apparatus, killed the last Yorkist king, and claimed the crown as King Henry VII. The English bureaucratic elite had spent the 15th century constructing impenetrable legal fortresses, passing draconian penal laws, and executing systematic purges to protect their monopoly on power. Ultimately, their entire political order was permanently conquered by the direct descendant of a penalized Welsh operative. By penetrating the absolute core of the royal wardrobe, Owen Tudor successfully dismantled the state's deeply paranoid defensive perimeter. He firmly embedded his lineage directly into the apex of global power, birthing a legendary dynasty that would permanently redesign the architecture of the modern world.